sometimes you have to bulldog things to make sure they stay on track. Okay, so now I wanted to take a little bit of a look. This is our third time looking at a part of our police manual, police department manual. And so I'm going to try to share my screen so we can all take a look at it. And a particular part that I want to look at is that part that talks about the use of force. It's about 1,000-page manual, I think. And starting on page 54 is policy section 300. And that is the start of the use of force. So there's page 53, chapter 3, general operations. Policy 300, use of force. This has been a big part of 8 Can't Wait and Black Lives Matter. So purpose and scope provides guidelines on the reasonable use of force. And there's no way to specify the exact amount or type of force for any given situation, but every member of this police department is expected to use these guidelines to make decisions in a professional and an impartial, reasonable manner. So deadly force, use of force that creates a substantial risk of causing death or serious bodily injury, but it's not limited to a discharge of a firearm. Force itself is the application of tactics, chemicals, weapons to another person. It's not the use of force when a person allows him or herself to be searched, escorted, handcuffed, or restrained. So I guess it's when you're dealing with resistance that you're dealing with force. The duty to intercede, I'm going to jump through this a little quickly. So policy 300.2.1 is important because it's one of the 8 Can't Wait policies, one of the 8 policies that Black Lives Matters sometimes uses as suggestions they have. And one of those is a duty to intervene or intercede. And our police chief has told us, well, we've already got that one covered because it's already in our policy manual. And I think she's referring to this. Here it is. Any officer present observing another officer using force that's clearly beyond that which is objectively reasonable shall, not should, shall intercede to prevent the use of unreasonable force. If an officer observes another employee use force that exceeds the degree of force permitted by law, should, not shall, but should promptly report these observations to a supervisor. So if I'm a member of the public and I'm trying to protect people more from unnecessary harm, I would look at some of these shoulds and I would ask, why would an officer not have to report promptly the excessive use of force if I were to observe another officer doing that? But those are the kinds of details that we're going to need to be intelligent about the current policy in order to recommend changes in policy. And we'll talk a little bit later about changes coming down the pipe due to SB 230, a state law that requires many changes in the realm of use of force to every city's police department's policies. So while they're already changing some of these things, then that's our opportunity to say, okay, how deep do we want to go with the change? Do we want to change them minimally, or do we want to do something more than minimal in each different case? Like in this case, section 300.2.1, there's something in SB 230 about interceding. So we need to keep an eye on that because that might be something we might want to change if there's ways to improve it to better protect the public without reducing the effectiveness of the officers and their own safety. Talks about factors that are needed to be used to determine whether or not to use force. And one of those is if the officer perceives how the officer perceives the conduct of the individual being confronted. And you can tell that that's probably very biased because if I'm an 80-year-old little man or I'm a 18-year-old large man, that might make a difference. And the perception of the officer can probably change based on the subject's, demographics and age and size and all that. Other officer subject factors, age, strength, skill of the officer versus the subjects, drugs and alcohol the mental capacity of the subject, the public, whether there's weapons nearby, that's D, the degree to which the subject's already been effectively restrained and his or her ability to resist despite being restrained, the availability of other options, seriousness, G, seriousness of the suspected offense or reason. So if it's a murder or it's falling asleep in your car, there might be different levels of force that are expected based on the circumstances, such as that. The experience of the officer, what kind of training that officer has, the potential for injury to everybody involved, including bystanders, the officers themselves, and the suspects, the risk of escape, and other exigent circumstances. The risk of escape, to me, number J, is very interesting, because if I'm escaping from a shoplifting versus I'm escaping from armed robbery, I think we need to have some public discussion about when does risk of escape matter more in some situations, because we've seen a lot of people across the country who are running away that are either hurt or killed, and their crimes sometimes are very small ones, or they're suspected crimes. So I think part of the discussion is, what's our policy, or what should it be to let people go rather than use force on them to keep them? And we'll get into that because that'll come up again later on under a different section. And I think that looking at it from the perspective of an officer, these paragraphs are really coming at it from what would it be like if we were police officers. It's recognized that officers are expected to make split-second decisions, and that the amount an officer's time is available to evaluate and respond to changing circumstances may impact her or his decision. While various degrees of force exist, each officer is expected to use only that degree of force reasonable under the circumstances to accomplish the law enforcement purpose in accordance with this policy. And that, I think, relates to the risk of escape and the seriousness of the crime. And so I think that the law enforcement purpose might be to detain someone who's a shoplifter or walking drunk in public, but that can go south quickly, as we've seen around the country. And so are those walking drunk in publics or shoplifting, are they worth having a very dramatic, injurious situation coming out of them so that they're escalated from where they started? Or does de-escalation require a little bit more leniency, and maybe we don't detain that walking drunk or that shoplifter if that shoplifter or drunk person happens to escape, and our policy says that we don't want to escalate those situations. But that, I don't know what the answer is. I just know that that's something that's up for discussion because of what has caused Black Lives Matter, which is a lot of low risk situations, low crime situations going south and turning into highly injurious, serious interactions between law enforcement and suspects. Non-deadly force applications. Any application that is not reasonably anticipated to cause basically death or serious injury. So there's deadly force applications by officers, and there's non-deadly force. Each officer is provided with equipment, training, and skills to control suspects. And I think this is very interesting, the last sentence. Non-deadly force applications may include, but are not limited to, leg restraints, control devices, and taser. So, I think of taser as pretty harmful, but that's a non-deadly force application because for most people, it's not likely to result in serious injury or death. But it kind of gives us the reality of what the policy says, that tasers are non-deadly force, but none of us would ever want to be tased, I'm sure of that. We have some more use of force, talking about using only that force that is reasonably necessary. Again, from the officer's perspective, given that no policy can realistically predict every possible situation, officers are entrusted to use well-reasoned discretion in determining the appropriate use of force. And there again, I think that some policy clarification would help if our policy was to go more lenient on low-level crimes. Then the well-reasoned discretion might be, this is one of those crimes where that person was asleep on a park bench. He got scared when I approached. Maybe he had some marijuana or some other drug on his body, and he ran because he didn't want to be caught. My well-reasoned discretion might be not to give chase or not to use force if it's needed to catch him. But right now, I think that an officer might encounter a low risk subject or person and decide that it's reasonable within her discretion or his discretion to apply force to catch and retain that person. And maybe that's okay, but maybe it's not okay. I just think it's probably worth at this time with Black Lives Matter some public discussion about that. Okay, we can go down to talking about pain compliance, and officers utilizing pain compliance should consider the degree to which the technique may be controlled given the level of resistance. So I guess that means, can you increase or decrease the pain if the subject is resisting or not resisting? Whether the person is able to comply with the orders of an officer. I guess you apply more pain if the person can't comply. Or maybe you don't apply pain if the person is mentally disabled and doesn't understand your directions. I don't think you would continue to apply force, but I'm not really clear on that. But we all probably need to get clear on that. Whether the person has been given sufficient opportunity to comply. And that has to do with de-escalation techniques, which we might have time to get into or we might not have time to get into. Final word on that pain compliance technique application is that any pain compliance technique shall be discontinued once the officer determines that compliance has been achieved. In the George Floyd case, during that 8.5 minutes, I think most people would say that compliance had been achieved, but the technique applied that was causing him pain was not discontinued and caused his death, even after he was pretty submissive under those 3 officers who were on him. Okay, we get to something that's very controversial. It's one of the 8 can't wait. In fact, it's number 1 in the 8 can't wait, and it's no chokeholds. A carotid control hold is similar to a chokehold. Some people think it's the same as a chokehold, although police officers distinguish between chokeholds and carotid control holds. On June 5th, the governor of California said that he would be directing that chokeholds no longer be included in the training of California police officers. The next day, our city's police chief reported she had changed our policy so that no carotid control holds would any longer be allowed in non-deadly circumstances. You could still, she said, use a pencil and poke someone's eye, or you could kick them in the groin, or you could choke them any way you wanted to if it was a deadly application of force. But in non-deadly force situations, no longer in the city of Marina are these control holds allowed. However, if you go on the city's website, like I did the last few weeks, including tonight, there's a lot in there about these carotid control holds. And so we need to ask the question, why does the public still see a lot of information about how to use carotid control holds if they're not any longer allowed? So we need to just be aware of that. But it's possible that officially the policy has changed, but the policy manual has not been changed. So there's a lot there about carotid holds that I'd like to skip for tonight because there's a potential that those are no longer in the official manual. And now we get to this next section about how to use force to make an arrest. Any peace officer may use reasonable force to make an arrest, prevent escape, which I think is a big one, or to overcome resistance. So if I'm a 16-year-old and I have a backpack with a couple of joints in it, and a police officer attempts to detain me and I run away, and if there's been a nearby crime, a burglary or something, what kind of techniques can the officers use to prevent escapes? And when should they be able to prevent escapes? And when should they be directed to let the escape happen to avoid it turning into something that's unnecessarily serious for that situation? There was something in here about an officer not ever needing to retreat, but that's not the place here. But it does talk about retreat, where retreat does not mean tactical repositioning or other de-escalation techniques. So if an officer repositions herself or himself, even if they're moving backwards, that's not retreat. And de-escalating their use of techniques is not retreating. So I think retreating might be disengaging with the subject and letting the subject have the space to do what the subject was doing or wanted to do. There is somewhere in here, and I think I may have missed it, that says that an officer is never required to retreat. And that, once we find where that is, I think that's another point that we could look at, because if an officer is never required to retreat, that's maybe why we run into some situations where the public might wish that the officer had let the subject go and retreated. I know during these Black Lives Matter protests, the officers appear to be retreating all the time, but maybe they're just repositioning their vehicles to give the protesters space, and they're practicing de-escalation techniques. To the layperson, it looks like they're retreating when the protesters come up to them and the officers get in their car and they drive away, rather than confronting or stopping the protesters. So I don't understand what retreat means, as it distinguishes itself from repositioning or de-escalation, but I need to learn that. There's factors here to use the reasonableness of force, and I won't go through all of these because of the time of tonight. I think we've taken a good enough peek into the use of force. And so what I want to do is just go as a goodbye step to their policy. I just want to go to the table of contents so you can kind of get an idea of what we looked at and what we didn't. Sorry for this. So it's a 734-page document that includes all of the city's police policies. And on the right-hand side is the page number. On the left-hand side is the section number. Sorry about this. It's just not that easy to move around because it's a big document and it moves quick. We've gone over some of these code of ethics in previous town halls. So here's the table of contents. And it starts to get mostly serious when you get to chapter 3, which what we were looking at. We were looking at use of force. We didn't get to shooting policy. We didn't get to vehicle pursuits, which is another 8 can't wait demand, that there's no shooting involved at moving vehicles. We didn't get to domestic violence, and we know that that's a big issue in the public, because domestic violence and other situations that probably could use social workers when they only get enforcement professionals, sometimes those domestic violence situations get worse than they need to be. Let's see what else is in that section of 300s. Hate crimes, handcuffing policies. Anyway, so that section is a pretty important one, and it's a pretty long one. So that's just a little look into how the police manual is organized. And I think that the 8 can't wait policies, most of them are going to be found in this chapter 3, which is really about how police officers engage with potential suspects or potential crimes. Okay, so before I go into SB 230 and how it might affect all of this, I wanted to open it up to questions, comments, so we can have a discussion with all of you. And Carissa, why don't you lead off since you have your hand up? So go ahead, everybody. If you raise your Zoom hand, or if you don't know how to do that, just wiggle your hand. Carissa, I think you're, okay. There you go.
Yeah, I'm unmuted. Okay, so, all right. So I appreciate you going through the policy and spending so much time thinking and studying about this and trying to understand along with all of us, like, where we need to change. But I think that what the Black Lives Matter movement is asking for is a lot broader change than just looking at the policy that's already in place, because we know that's not serving our communities well enough. So I think that we're looking at like a whole restructuring of the system, and so I think our focus maybe needs to shift more to the Cahoots program that we were talking about. And I know that Adam is already on board with that and has been trying to work on it. So I think we need to find out what he's doing and who he's collaborating with and how we can help move that forward. And because a lot of these issues really just require mental health professionals. Like the thing that happened in Monterey.
Carissa, let me interrupt you just for a moment. To the extent that you're correct, and I think you are, all of those Cahoots and other kinds of changes are going to result in policy changes in this manual. How they respond to domestic violence, which is right now in the manual, and how they respond.
Sure.
You know, it would be different if we were going to go to the Oregon model of what we refer to as Cahoots. But I'm sorry for interrupting you, but I agree with you 100%. But I think in the end, everything that you want is going to have to be spelled out very specifically in this manual because it's
That's
so
true.
legal.
I understand. I totally understand. The tricky part about the policy, though, is that the company that writes it, Lexipol, they're a bunch of lawyers whose job is to protect the police, and protect their jobs. So is that helping our community?
It is if it's a public process. So if we start with the Lexipol recommendations and we understand what the policy says and what they're telling us needs to change, and it doesn't get us to the Cahoots, then we're ready with language from Cahoots that we tell City Council to put into the policy in addition to the consultant's recommendation so that the policy change goes deeper than the consultant initially recommends.
I totally respect what you're saying. I just want to make sure that we're keeping our focus broad and not just on the 8 can't wait, because as the police chief said, that we're already pretty much following those things. So if we focus too closely on that, we might lose the bigger picture. Mm-hmm. That's all I'm trying to say.
Right. Now, those 8 can't wait policies that refer to policy changes required by SB 230, they're going to change. But they're going to probably change to the minimum if it's just Lexipol, if it's without the public. So like that it says should and shall, we need to look at that. And then when it gets to what happens if they violate a shall, if they violate a should, if the policy is not changed in the disciplinarian realm, sure, then we're not probably going to be satisfied. We want to know how accountable are they to be following these policies. And I don't see anything so far in the policies that make me understand what happens if they're violated. So I assume in most cases it's an internal investigation. And I think that's part of the Black Lives Matter demand, is that there be more public transparency to the reporting of use of force and the reporting of citizen complaints, et cetera, et cetera. So just making the policy changes to so that everyone can say 8 can't wait is being implemented, it doesn't go far enough, because 8 can't wait doesn't go very deep into the weeds that I've seen. And I think that we're going to want to get into the weeds before we're going to know that we're actually implementing the spirit of Black Lives Matter and the spirit of 8 can't wait.
Yeah, and I wanted to say, I'm not trying to blame you for not understanding it. I've been learning about this like very quickly in the last few weeks, and I sent you something about 8 can't wait like 3 weeks ago, and then I learned that's way not enough, and so I kind of derailed you. And anyways, I take ownership of that. Can I ask one question though?
You have all the time you want.
So did you hear about what happened in Monterey? I believe it was over the weekend. There was a young gentleman who said he was suicidal. He had a BB gun. No. Okay. So he was saying he was suicidal, and he had what looked like a pistol. And from the outside, it looked like a real gun, but it ended up being a BB gun. From what I read, so Monterey police showed up, and they, oh shoot, I might have to have somebody else explain what happened, because I don't know the exact order of events. But eventually, what ended up happening was he was shot with a non-lethal weapon himself. He was shot, and another officer tried to shoot him with a real gun, but missed, and then they took him into custody. And this young guy was saying he was suicidal. He did say he was going to shoot, but it was just a BB gun that he was holding. So it's one of those situations where it's like this guy is suffering from mental illness and he's suicidal, and then what ends up happening at the end of the day is he's in jail and now has a criminal record. And how is that helping him? So
or society.
Or yeah, so it's just something to think about, and just another one of the issues where it's like, how could the police have responded differently? How could a mental health expert responded to it more effectively?
And what does the police policy manual dictate that might have relevance on that situation? That's a really tough one, but I think it does get back in every case to the manual, because that's the starting point, is what that manual allows officers or prohibits the officers from doing. Anything more, Carissa?
Oh, I have a lot more to say, but not right now.
Okay, well, jump in when you want. We'll go to Nathaniel and then Danielle.
Good evening, everyone.
Hi.
So I'm gonna actually bring in my job in this, because that it will actually start talking about some things. I actually had a victim of sex trafficking who lives here in Marina. I'm a human trafficking, mostly labor trafficking specialist for the county, but because of my colleague has some personal issues, I'm taking on domestic and sex trafficking right now as well. And this woman who's staying in a hotel here in Marina is a prostitute. Of course, I can't give you that too much information on it, but long story short, she was afraid to call Marina local law enforcement because she's afraid of the police. You know, as a guy who it's pretty much as an intake, all I do is take the information of these victims, and I pass the information on to a counselor, to a legal associate that we have, and we give them shelter. Sometimes we pay for their hotels, things like that. But if we can't use our local law enforcement because our victims are afraid to be thrown into a jail, because they are victims of something, regardless what it is, if it's domestic violence to sex trafficking to being an undocumented immigrant, we have problems. And I was listening. First, I want to say AB 230. We're going to talk about that later, but it's perfect. But you know something interesting about AB 230 and AB 392, we're not really applying them into our local law. I'm talking local right now, Marina law enforcement agencies. And listening to just a little bit that Bruce was talking about, sadly, I've been busy all day. I didn't get to really go through Marina's policy and procedures, but just a little bit that he told us, it sounds like they were mostly trying to save their butts and not really implementing AB 230 guidelines at all. Shall and should, we should question that, because those are wordings that you can play with to protect you. Also, pain should not.
Can I interrupt you for just a moment?
Go ahead.
You can have the floor back. The AB 230 is not yet infused into our policy. So what we have right now is our current old policy, and AB 230 requires what we saw tonight to be changed. Hasn't yet been, but go ahead.
Okay. And for the folks that haven't looked at AB 230, just a quick, small snippets of it. Existing law requires each law enforcement agency to annually furnish specified information to the Department of Justice regarding the use of force by a peace officer. Each year, a police department summary should be given out to the public, but that's not until January 2021, where it should be taking effect. But we can have it earlier than that. It's just that's the deadline for when all agencies in California need to apply this. We need to start establishing 8 can't wait is beautiful in a way, but we need to go beyond 8 can't wait. It's bigger than 8 can't wait. We should not be using non-lethal weapons. Should not be killing people. If they're less than lethal, then they should not. You've seen George Floyd. You've seen what happened with him. That was a cardi. What do you? Just to get the wording right, that was technically a carotid control hold that officer put George Floyd in. That is legal in Marina. To currently is legal and from what the policy and procedures that we just looked at.
Can I interrupt you just for a second? If you can see my screen, what we're told is that the chokeholds of any kind are now prohibited for non-lethal force as of June 6th. The policy doesn't look like it, and I'm hoping there's just a lag in updating the policy. Go ahead, Nathaniel.
No, I mean, yeah, you're right, but that's the problem, though. Our policies need to reflect what our state government is bringing up. That's all I want to say right now is that we need to change. We're fighting the Black Lives Matter movement, and all of us are fighting for federal change. But let's look at our local law enforcement agency right now, and let's see what we can do at home, because we have a lot of people of color that need change right now here at our home. We can't talk about Seaside, Salinas right now. It's all about Marina and what we can do in the city. I live here right now. I'm going to have kids one day to hear. Christina Medina has young, brown, little, beautiful girls that I'm sure she wants to make sure when they're older, they're not discriminated against. And I'm sure the rest of you can feel the same way. So that's what we're fighting today. We're not fighting for Salinas. We're not fighting for Seaside. We'll do that on Saturday and Sundays and every other day. Today, let's talk about what we can do for Marina.
Right on, Nate. Thank you very much. And thank you for letting me interrupt you now and then. I hope it doesn't bother you too much. Okay, let's go to Danielle.
Good evening, everyone. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, good evening.
Hi. I had one question and then one comment. So my question was, Bruce, would you mind speaking to what is the city council's involvement in the manual revisions? Do you vote on those revisions? Do you have authority in those revisions, or are you more of a recommendation board?
The police chief would say that we have the say-so as a city council what goes into that policy manual. But tradition and practice has been that the city council defers 100% to the police. We don't get into the details. We don't know what they say. This is my first time the last few weeks looking into our police manual. They've never come before me, and I've been on city council basically since the year 2000, with a few years, 2004 to 2008, where I wasn't. But anyway, there's been many policy changes since then brought down by Lexapol on a yearly basis. And we on city council don't want to see them in the past. We have not wanted to see them. We have not thought about them. We've surely never deliberated about them, and never has it been a public process to do so. So this is unprecedented opportunity where we have to have major changes with the AB 230. At the same time, that passed last year in 2019. At the same time, we have Black Lives Matter. So it's a perfect storm for us breaking tradition and having the public and the city council involved for the first time in what you've just spoken about.
Great, thank you. And then my comment, I typed it out just because I knew I wasn't going to be very eloquent trying to speak off the cuff, but I guess I just wanted to say that, you know.
Danielle, sorry to interrupt you. There's a problem with the audio. It sounds like there's something going on with your audio. We can hear you, but it's distracting. Now we can't hear you at all. It sounds like you're cussing at me.
Oh, is this any better?
Yeah, that's perfect.
Okay. So the other item, I just wrote out some notes, and I just wanted to mention, you know, if you look at the training that law enforcement officers have to go through, they have to fit 1 million things in a very tiny time frame in their training. And I honestly feel bad for how diverse their job needs to be in everything that they are asked to be expert on. So I want to kind of mention that empathy and that concern for how much is on the plate of law enforcement officers. I'm a clinical psychologist that required 4 years of undergraduate training plus 6 years of graduate level training specifically in how to treat and care for people living with severe mental illness. And even at my level of training, it would be incredibly difficult to do the crisis intervention needed in a quote unquote suicide by cop situation, like what Chris had just mentioned. And so I think the example of this recent incident that Carissa brought up shows that it is unfair to law enforcement officers to ask them to take on so many different high stakes, important roles, especially when there are other people in our community who have intense amounts of training related to mental health and crisis intervention that could be a supportive role in that context. And so I just kind of wanted to bring that up, that, you know, if we could take one intense thing off of the plates of a law enforcement officer and give it to somebody else whose entire training has been focused on how to interact with and de-escalate crisis situations, I think everyone wins, including law enforcement officers who might feel like, oh my gosh, thank you for taking that role away from me because it's so intense and so challenging. I would love the help of someone who's licensed and trained to do this work. So,
well, in a simple,
for a law enforcement officer, but I would imagine that there might be some relief in having that assistance.
and I think that when Carissa talks about the Oregon's program and that what we see happening in Denver, it really boils down to money to pay for expertise to either assist or replace the presence of an officer on calls they get or the 911 dispatch gets that do not require enforcement. And we've heard a lot about volunteer experts who are trained as you are, Danielle, and they take like 24,000 calls since they started in the COOTS program, and they've only had to call an officer on something like 300 of them or 200 of them or 600 of them. Your point is well taken, and my only response is that it's just a matter of money. And probably for $200,000 or less per year, the city could have all of its necessary assistance replacement. So it doesn't even have to come out of the police department budget. It could just be something that's augmented funding in a new direction. So we're sitting on at least $3 million that we haven't used for the last 10 years. And we're expecting to get more money as time goes on. So it's going to get easier, not harder, for us to be able to afford what you're talking about. We can already afford it. Now that's assuming that the COVID doesn't take us for a much deeper dive than any of us have thought about, because we're expecting a pretty deep financial hit. And still, we're going to end up with $8 million in the bank as of June 30th, 1st, or June 30th, 2021. That's not counting $2 million coming in November with a statewide ballot initiative that's likely to pass. That would up the $8 million to $10 million. So I'm just saying that we could afford it if it's important for enough for us to spend it, and it probably wouldn't require it wouldn't require inability to do something else that's really important to us. Although there's always a list of things longer than the money we have to spend. But if this is an important matter, moderate to high importance value, we have the money to afford it, but we don't have the roadmap in our experience. We have to look elsewhere outside of the city and probably outside the county to know how to implement that kind of a program. Okay, we're going to go to Kathy next. Thank you, Danielle.
Thank you. One of the other things too, because having a long career in nursing for a long career, I don't want to admit how long, but I'm also very practical, and so I have hired for inpatient units, evening shifts, night shifts. I've been in home health and private duty nursing, where you have shifts in the evening, or private duty 24-hour care, and then also in psych hospitals, et cetera. And I will tell you that it's really difficult to staff, evening and night shifts. And so just as a practical thing, when you look at, yes, we have to have the money, but are we going to be able to staff social workers and psychiatric nurses or whatever, to be on call throughout the night where a lot of these really, really dire situations happen? And so just, not to say that it can't happen, but you have to have somebody on call if you're not doing the full-time stuff. And a lot of people that I know that are in social work and psychiatric services, we don't usually have the night shifts staffed. I mean, except in inpatient units. So that would be a very, very hard thing to recruit, especially from a more limited area like we have. So again, I always have this practical kind of look at things that we know we need, but how do you actually, staff those positions?
And Kathy, that's a good point, and that's the number one response that our chief of police gave us. She said, this is all well and good, but most of our calls that are mental abuse, or I'm sorry, mental situation, or substance abuse or homeless issues, they come in the early hours of the night or the morning, and there's nobody in the social service realm available. And what I've heard as a response to that is that you get other cities in the county, along with Marina, to chip in monies so that there's a regional availability for when those calls come in. So it's not just Marina working on its own, because that would be very difficult 24/7 to have somebody paid to be on call. Maybe on call is a lot less than actually being on a shift, because maybe sometimes on call you don't get call, you still get like $10 an hour or something for being on call, but it's not the same as working. But anyway, that there are ways around it to get 24/7 social workers to come to these incidents. And I think that we only need to look at Oregon and Denver, because nothing that we're thinking or talking about tonight everything we're talking about has been successfully implemented elsewhere. We just need to find out, how did they do it, and how much did it cost, and was it regional? And probably it's regional and not city by city, working independently of one another.
Yes, and certainly the availability of those kinds of trained professionals in a much larger city like Denver. That's, I think, again, it's a different challenge than even here if we even collate, all of the cities and stuff. So just something to think about, because the reality always, tends to interfere with our best intentions.
Good points. Thank you. Okay, let's go to Christina and then Nathaniel.
Hello. There we go. Hi. Brought up the point I was going to make about a regional approach. They do that with fire departments and in other ways. But what about nonprofits? I don't know if you went down this path yet. We have many nonprofits that do provide like Interim and other organizations that do provide mental health services in crisis and various levels. So maybe that might also be something down the road. And then later on, from the point of view of if something like this does get established, there may very well be grant money for this, in the sense that if you make a hire, like a police hire, that you have that special training, or what is the lady that was speaking, Danielle, she has so many years behind her, but maybe there is some special training that can get us part way there with the help of federal grants or anything like that. Anyways, so I was just thinking ahead a couple steps, but I definitely think we should maybe pursue the nonprofit angle, because there's organizations that do this locally.
Yeah. As we look to not recreate the wheel around the nation, nonprofits have played large roles in getting us to where we want to be ourselves. So that's definitely a high likely option that we involve nonprofits in. That doesn't mean that they do it for free if they're a nonprofit, but to be sustainable and be available 24/7, it's not going to be on a volunteer basis. And so sustainability of such a program using nonprofits or other for-profits is going to require new money. But I think you're right, nonprofits should be considered strongly, because that's what's been helpful in other places around the nation. specifically trained police to better handle these situations may or may not, I think it may take us away from where Black Lives Matter and all of our discussion is taking us, is to get the gun off of the body of the person that's responding. And so getting a specially trained police officer is better than having a less trained police officer. But I think most people in the Black Lives Movement would say that a specifically trained police officer would not be as good as a social worker who's got the more in-depth training. But maybe that specifically trained police officer is an interim step before we get to the nirvana of having fully staffed non-enforcement social worker staff helping us. All right, Nathaniel, go ahead.
All right. As one of the leaders of the Black Lives Matter movement here in Monterey County, who started the first march in Monterey County, threw it to Tyler Williams, and I let him use his political powers to help me out in Monterey. I will say that it's all about taking the guns off the streets when it comes to law enforcement and regular citizens. And I want to touch base on what Kathy and Christina had already spoke about in regards to nonprofits. And someone mentioned earlier how law enforcement officers are so overworked, and they are. I was a corrections officer for over 3.5 years, and just seeing all the trauma, the mental health issues that the inmates had, and I had no skills for that. I was literally in undergrad school at 19 years old studying criminal justice and Spanish. I had no real training on how to deal with people like that, and we had no one in our jail and prison systems that actually handled that. We had to call people from outside of our prison system to handle those situations. And I would say the same thing for when I was learning from my law enforcement mentors on the streets. It's the same thing. And I would say that we have, like Christina already mentioned, nonprofits do play a vital role. We have YWC of Monterey County, where we handle domestic violence issues. Instead of putting them in jails, we put them in shelters. We put them in hotels. We give them counseling. We want to use our money, but we literally have to use our money. That's what we're getting funded. I don't want to put our money out there because I haven't talked to my CEO about that yet. But let's just say we're in the millions. We're pretty well funded, and we need the people. You send them our way, we're going to be able to help law enforcement out drastically. We have Doherty's Place, where they handle domestic violence. They handle sex trafficking, things like that. We have county social workers already that are staffed 24/7 to handle calls. We have all these things, and we need to make sure that our law enforcement agencies have these numbers, have these organizations. And I'm speaking specifically in Marina. If they have someone that needs to get away from their abuser, they need to be able to know the YWC of Monterey County number. So they call me or one of my colleagues, and we can put them in a hotel. We can give them a new place to live. We can pay their rent for however long until they get on their feet. These are the things that we do have right now. And we need to start talking about those things and implementing them into our future policy here in Marina. That's all I have to say for right now.
That's great. Thank you very much.